I wasn't gone that long, and that is probably the part that kept bothering me after, because if I had been away for months, or if I had moved somewhere else for work and only came back every now and then, maybe I could have understood how people started acting like my place was available. But I was gone for a little over 2 weeks, and during that time I was still paying for everything the same way I always did, which meant the apartment was not abandoned, not sitting empty in any real sense, and definitely not open for anyone to treat it like backup housing. It was my apartment in the most ordinary, unremarkable way possible, which is exactly why it mattered to me. It was not some giant achievement story I dragged into every conversation, and it was not one of those places people romanticize just because they finally bought something. It was simply mine, paid by me, arranged the way I liked it, and quiet in a way that made coming home feel predictable, which is honestly one of the main things I value about living alone. I knew where everything was. I knew what was in the fridge. I knew what the place smelled like when I opened the door, and I knew that when I came back after work or after being away for a bit, I would be stepping back into something that still belonged entirely to me. Before I left, I had done what I always do when I know I'll be gone for more than a day or two. I cleaned up properly, emptied what needed to be emptied, made sure nothing was left out, and locked everything in that mildly obsessive way people develop when they live alone long enough and get used to the comfort of their own routines. I checked the windows, checked the kitchen, checked the bedroom, and when I locked the front door, I remember doing that thing where you pull on it once after turning the key, not because you think someone is waiting to break in, but because once a habit settles into your body, you stop doing it consciously and just trust the repetition. While I was away, nothing seemed unusual. I was busy enough that most days blurred into each other, and the whole trip had that same dull, practical rhythm that work travel usually has when it is more inconvenience than adventure. I was out of my normal schedule, sleeping badly, eating whatever was easiest, and counting down to when I could finally come back home and get back to my own place, my own bed, my own quiet. So the apartment itself stayed in my head as something fixed and untouched. I called home a couple of times, mostly out of routine, and my mom called me once too. Nothing in those conversations stood out to me. Nobody sounded strange. Nobody hinted at anything. And if anything, the whole thing felt slightly more ordinary than usual, which is exactly why I didn't suspect anything. That matters, because if there had been even one weird pause, one sentence that didn't fit, one awkward attempt to avoid a subject, I would probably have kept pulling at it until I got an answer. That is not me trying to sound smart after the fact. That is just how I am. When something feels off, I usually notice it. The problem this time was that nothing felt off until I got back, and by then whatever had happened was already happening. I got home later than I expected on the day I returned, and I was in that very specific mood you get after traveling, where you are too tired to be excited but still relieved enough that all you want is to get through the door, drop your bag, maybe stand in the shower for too long, and then do absolutely nothing for a few hours without anybody needing anything from you. I remember even thinking, while I was climbing the stairs, that at least the worst part of the day was over. That sounds stupid now, but it is funny how often people think that right before something gets more complicated. When I got to the door, the first thing that registered was not some huge sign that someone had taken over the place. It was smaller than that, which is part of why my brain didn't immediately jump to the correct conclusion. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and before I even stepped fully inside, I noticed there was a pair of shoes near the entrance that didn't belong to me. At first, I did what people usually do with details like that, and reached for the quickest normal explanation. Maybe one of my parents had stopped by for some reason. Maybe someone brought something over. Maybe I left the door to my own assumptions open because I was tired and not paying attention. Then I stepped in properly and saw that the shoes were not the only thing that was wrong. There was a backpack by the wall that I had never seen before, and there was a jacket hanging over the dining chair in that lazy, lived-in way that doesn't belong to quick visits. On the table there was a glass with a little water still in it, and I knew immediately it wasn't mine, not because I have some magical memory for objects, but because when you live alone long enough, you know the visual weight of your own space. You know when something is missing, when something has been moved, and when something has entered the room that doesn't belong there. I didn't react yet. I just stood there for a second with my bag still in my hand, letting my eyes move around the room while my brain kept trying to force the situation back into something normal. It is strange how long the mind resists the obvious when the obvious is inconvenient. Even then I wasn't thinking, someone is living here. I was thinking, okay, someone has been here, and that difference matters, because the first one forces a bigger reaction than the second one. I closed the door behind me, put my bag down slowly, and walked further in. The apartment was not trashed, and in a way that almost made it worse, because if the place had been chaotic, if something had been broken, if drawers had been open or things were clearly out of control, the reaction would have been simple. Anger is easy when the violation is loud. This wasn't loud. This was subtle enough to make you question yourself, while still being wrong in ways that became clearer with every step. I moved toward the kitchen and saw dishes in the sink that I had not left there before I went away, and there was food in the fridge that I didn't buy and would never buy for myself. It wasn't one or two random items either, not the kind of thing you can dismiss as someone dropping something off. It looked like someone had already started stocking the place around their own habits. That was the first moment where the timeline in my head changed, because a quick visit does not usually leave that kind of trace. Someone had not just passed through. Someone had started using the apartment. I remember standing there with the fridge door still open for a second longer than necessary, staring at things that meant absolutely nothing on their own, and yet together they were saying something very specific. There were brands I never buy, food I never keep in the house, and containers that had clearly been opened and used more than once. None of that sounds dramatic when you say it out loud, but when it is your place, and you know exactly how you left it, those little details stack up very quickly into something you can no longer explain away. That was when I went to the bedroom, and even before I opened the door, I could already tell it wasn't right, because the door was slightly open in a way I don't leave it. I pushed it wider and saw clothes on the chair that weren't mine, a charger plugged into the wall on my side of the room, and the bed shifted just enough to show that someone had used it or at least been in there long enough to stop treating it like someone else's room. It wasn't chaotic, and it wasn't disrespectful in the stupid, obvious way people imagine when they hear a story like this. It was worse than that, because it looked settled. It looked like the kind of quiet rearrangement that only happens when somebody has already decided they are not just stopping by. At that point, my brain ran out of normal explanations. It stopped being someone came over and became someone is staying here. And once you get to that thought, the next question comes automatically, because it is the only one left that matters. Who? And right after that, before I even had time to fully ask it in my head, I heard movement from the living room. It wasn't sudden enough to scare me, and it wasn't loud enough to sound confrontational. It was just the ordinary sound of another person being comfortable in a place they assume is available to them, which somehow made it more irritating than if I had walked into an obvious scene. There was no sign of panic, no clumsy attempt to hide the fact that someone was there, and that alone told me more than anything else. Whoever it was did not think they needed to explain themselves immediately. I walked back toward the living room, and I was still trying, even then, to prepare myself for some version of the situation that would make sense once I saw it directly. Maybe one of my parents had given someone access to water plants or check on the place. Maybe something happened, and someone had needed to stay one night. Maybe there was some explanation that would be stupid and annoying, but still explainable. I wasn't calm, exactly, but I was trying very hard not to jump ahead of what I actually knew. Then I turned the corner and saw my brother sitting on my couch. He wasn't standing awkwardly with his jacket in his hands. He wasn't in that half-embarrassed posture people have when they know they've been caught somewhere they shouldn't be. He was sitting there in a completely normal way, leaning back like he had already spent enough time in the place for it to start feeling familiar. The television was on, and there was that ordinary domestic stillness around him that told me this wasn't his first hour there. He looked at me, and the thing that got to me immediately was not guilt, because guilt at least would have implied he understood the problem. What I saw instead was surprise at my timing, not surprise at my presence. He looked at me the way somebody looks at a roommate who came back earlier than expected, and before I even said anything, I knew that whatever explanation I was about to get was not going to start with an apology. It was going to start from the assumption that this arrangement already existed and that I had somehow just joined it late. That was the moment where the whole thing stopped being abstract and became direct enough that I could no longer give it the benefit of the doubt. My brother was in my apartment, sitting on my couch, surrounded by signs that he had not just arrived, and somewhere between me locking that door 2 weeks earlier and coming back home that evening, Somebody in my family had decided that this was acceptable. For a few seconds, I didn't say anything, and it wasn't because I was trying to make the moment heavier than it already was, but because there is always that small delay when your brain needs to catch up to something your eyes have already understood. He looked at me, then at my bag, then back at me again, and what stood out immediately was not guilt or even embarrassment, but the kind of mild surprise someone shows when their timing gets disrupted rather than when they get caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. He said, "I didn't know you were getting back this early," and in any other situation that sentence would have been harmless, but standing there in my own living room, surrounded by things that clearly showed he had been there for more than just a quick visit, it sounded completely detached from reality. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't start with an explanation, and didn't even attempt to acknowledge that something was off. He spoke as if I was the one entering a situation that already existed, not the other way around. I asked him directly what he was doing in my apartment, and instead of hesitating or scrambling for words, he answered in a calm, almost casual tone that made it very clear he didn't think he had done something wrong. He told me that our parents said it would be fine for him to stay there for a bit while he sorted some things out, and that they assumed it wouldn't be a big deal. The way he said it, without tension or hesitation, made it obvious that whatever conversation had happened before I got back had already framed this as something settled. I didn't raise my voice, and I think that confused him for a moment, because normally in our family I was the one who would listen first, process things, and only push back if something was really out of line. The problem this time was that this wasn't just about helping someone out or dealing with a temporary inconvenience. This was about the fact that someone had crossed into my personal space without asking me, and worse than that, had done it in a way that suggested my approval was optional. I asked him how long he had been staying there, and when he said 4 or 5 days, something shifted immediately. Up until that point, there had still been a small part of me trying to interpret the situation in the most forgiving way possible, like maybe he had just arrived that day, or maybe something had happened suddenly and he needed a place for a night or two. Hearing that he had been living there for nearly a week, using my apartment, sleeping there, eating there, and moving around in my space while I had no idea it was happening, removed any remaining doubt. I asked him who gave him the key, even though by then I already knew the answer, and he said our dad brought it over and that our mom knew about it. What bothered me wasn't just the answer itself, but the way he delivered it, like it was a simple, logistical detail, as if we were talking about someone picking up a spare charger rather than being handed access to a place that wasn't theirs to offer. He wasn't being aggressive, and he wasn't trying to push back against me. If anything, he looked like someone who had just started realizing that the ground he was standing on might not be as stable as he thought. He said he assumed they had talked to me and that he wouldn't have moved in if he thought I didn't know. And honestly, I believed him. He didn't sound like he was making excuses. He sounded like someone who had been placed into a situation that was already presented as approved. That didn't make it okay, but it clarified something important. He wasn't the one who had decided this was acceptable. He was the one who had been told it was. And that made the situation more frustrating in a different way, because instead of dealing with one person who knowingly crossed a line, I was now dealing with a chain of decisions that had been made without me, each one relying on the assumption that I would eventually go along with it. I asked him how long he planned to stay, and he gave me a vague answer about needing a little time to get things sorted out, which is exactly the kind of answer that sounds harmless until you realize it has no actual limit built into it. A little time can stretch as far as people are allowed to stretch it, and situations like this don't resolve themselves faster unless someone draws a line. I told him I was going to talk to our parents and that until then I didn't want him assuming anything about how long this was going to last. He nodded, and there was a visible shift in his posture, like he was starting to understand that whatever version of the situation had been presented to him before was no longer holding up. After that, I didn't escalate things immediately, and I didn't tell him to leave right then and there, even though I know that would be the expected reaction in a story like this. The truth is, in that moment, I wasn't interested in creating a scene before I understood how far our parents had taken this. I had just gotten back, I was exhausted, and I was still processing the fact that someone had been living in my apartment for days without me knowing. I took my phone and stepped into the kitchen, and even that felt wrong in a way that's hard to explain, because I was leaving my own living room to have a conversation about what was happening inside my own home. I called my mom first, because I knew she would pick up quickly, and because I also knew she would frame the situation in a way that tried to make it sound reasonable. She answered almost immediately, and when I told her I was home and that my brother was in my apartment, she didn't react like someone who had just been caught doing something clearly wrong. There was no hesitation, no denial, and no attempt to deflect. She simply said yes, she knew, and that they had meant to talk to me about it. But everything happened quickly and they thought, since it was family and only temporary, that I wouldn't make a big issue out of it. That sentence, broken down, explained everything. It happened quickly, minimized the decision. Its family justified it. It's temporary, made it seem manageable. And you won't make a big issue out of it, revealed what they were actually relying on, which wasn't my agreement, but my tolerance. I told her directly that the problem wasn't whether my brother needed help or not, but the fact that they had decided who gets to stay in my apartment without asking me and treated my key like something they had authority over. Instead of acknowledging that immediately, she started explaining the situation from his side, how he needed a place, how things were complicated, how it made sense for him to stay somewhere quiet. And then she said something that stuck with me more than anything else. You weren't even there. That line said more than everything else combined. In her mind, my absence had turned my apartment into something temporarily available, as if being physically away meant my control over the space was paused. That was the part that actually shifted the whole situation for me, because it wasn't just about someone staying there. It was about the idea that my presence was what validated my ownership, and without it, the space could be managed by someone else. I told her that not being there does not make my home available for family use, and she let out that familiar sigh that means, you're technically right, but I want you to let this go. She repeated that it was temporary, that he needed help, that they thought I would understand, and every version of that sentence translated to the same thing. They made the decision first and planned to deal with my reaction later. I ended the call without raising my voice, but also without leaving any room for confusion. I told her I was going to speak with Dad as well, and that the situation wasn't going to continue just because they assumed it would be easier that way. When I walked back into the living room, my brother wasn't watching TV anymore. He was sitting a little more upright, clearly aware that things had shifted, and that whatever version of the situation he had been told was now being questioned. I called my dad, and with him the conversation was more direct, almost blunt. He didn't try to soften things much. He said they did what they thought was necessary, that my brother needed a place, and that it didn't seem like a big issue for him to stay at my apartment for a few days, especially since I wasn't there. Every time he repeated that part, I could feel the same frustration building, because it kept coming back to the same assumption. Not that I agreed, but that I would accept it. I told him I wasn't arguing about whether my brother needed help. I was arguing about the fact that they treated my apartment like a shared family resource. He responded with something along the lines of, we're family, not strangers, as if that automatically erased the need for permission. And that's where everything became very clear for me. This wasn't about one bad decision. This was about a pattern of thinking where closeness gets translated into entitlement, where boundaries are treated like optional formalities, and where saying no is seen as overreacting rather than protecting something that is yours. I ended that call knowing that whatever happened next, the situation couldn't just go back to normal. Because once you see it clearly, it stops being a small issue. It becomes a line. And the only question left is whether you're willing to hold it. After I ended the call with my dad, I stood in the kitchen for a few seconds longer than I needed to, mostly because I wanted that extra moment to get my head straight before I went back into the living room and dealt with what was now very obviously no longer a misunderstanding. Up until then, there had still been a part of me trying to separate the people involved and tell myself that maybe my brother was just in the middle of something messy and had stepped into a situation that our parents had presented as already approved. But once I had both conversations and heard the same logic from each of them, just dressed differently, the whole thing stopped feeling accidental. It felt organized in the most casual and irritating family way possible, which is to say nobody sat down and announced, we are going to violate your boundaries now. But they still arrived at the same result by convincing themselves that urgency, familiarity, and my absence gave them the right to make a decision that wasn't theirs. When I walked back into the living room, the atmosphere had changed slightly, and it was one of those changes that would probably be invisible to anyone not directly involved. The television was still on, but my brother wasn't watching it anymore. He was sitting there in that tense, half-relaxed posture people fall into when they are trying to look normal, while also waiting to see how bad things are about to get. He looked up when I came in, and for a second it felt like both of us were waiting for the other one to define what the next 10 minutes were going to look like. I sat down, not on the couch next to him, but on the chair near the table, mostly because I needed the physical distance. It wasn't about intimidation or making a point through body language. I just didn't want to sit in my own living room beside someone who had been sleeping in my apartment for days without me knowing and pretend the whole thing was still casual enough for couch conversation. He asked, a little more carefully than before, what they said, and that question alone told me he already knew the answer wasn't good. I told him that they knew exactly what was happening, that they had given him the key on purpose, and that none of them seemed to understand why that was the actual problem. He didn't interrupt me when I said that. He just nodded once, slowly, and looked down for a second in the way people do when they realize they have stepped into something much uglier than the version they were told. Then he said he didn't know they hadn't spoken to me first, and I told him I believed that. I really did. I wasn't trying to be generous in some performative way. I believed him because his behavior fit that explanation much more than it fit the idea that he knowingly forced his way into my place. The problem was that believing him didn't make the situation any less real. It just meant I wasn't dealing with one person acting alone. I was dealing with a family system that had already decided what level of permission they needed and what level they could skip. He started explaining his own situation then, and for the first time since I got home, I got the fuller version of why he was there in the first place. Things had gone bad where he'd been staying. There had been an argument, money was tight, and our parents had told him this would be easier than trying to patch together something temporary somewhere else. He wasn't saying it to manipulate me, and that was obvious in the way he spoke. He wasn't stacking guilt or turning himself into a tragedy. He was giving context because he thought context would make the whole thing make more sense. And the truth is, some of it did make sense in the narrowest possible way. If you look at it from 10,000 feet up, yes, he needed somewhere to stay. Yes, our parents probably looked around mentally for the easiest available option. And yes, my apartment was empty while I was away. That logic is exactly what made the whole thing dangerous. Because once you strip out the part where I actually get to decide, the arrangement becomes very easy to defend. It becomes practical. It becomes temporary. It becomes family helping family. The only problem is that all of those words stop meaning what people pretend they mean once they are built on top of someone else's property and someone else's silence. I told him that I wasn't saying he had to solve his whole life that second, and I wasn't pretending I didn't understand why our parents thought my place was the simplest option. What I was saying was that they didn't get to decide that without me, and now that I was standing there in the middle of it, I wasn't going to just slide into the role they had already assigned me because it would be awkward to pull back. He listened without pushing back, which honestly made things more uncomfortable rather than less, because if he had gotten defensive, at least the conflict would have been simpler. Instead, he looked like someone who knew the structure around him was collapsing, but still didn't know where he was supposed to go when it did. I asked him something very basic after that, which was whether he had another place he could stay even temporarily if this had to end fast. He hesitated, and that hesitation was more real than anything else he had said so far, because it had the shape of an answer he didn't want to give. Eventually, he said maybe, but it would be messy, and that he had been hoping this would buy him enough time to sort things out properly. The phrase "buy him enough time" stayed with me, because that was exactly what my parents had done with my apartment. They had spent my space to purchase someone else's breathing room. That was also the moment where the practical part of my brain started pushing against the anger. Because when something is clearly wrong but also clearly messy, you end up trapped between the version of yourself that wants to shut it down immediately on principle and the version that knows real life doesn't become cleaner just because you've identified the boundary correctly. I didn't want him there. That was true. I also didn't want to become the person who threw his own brother out the same hour he got home if there was any way to untangle the situation without turning it into a full family war. Both of those things were true at the same time, and that is exactly the kind of tension that never sounds dramatic when you say it out loud, but feels exhausting in real time. I told him he was not staying there indefinitely and that I needed an actual timeline, not a bit, not until things settle, and not anything else soft enough to be stretched later. He asked what that meant exactly, and I said it meant that we were not doing the version of this where a few days quietly become 2 weeks, then a month, then some vague family situation where everyone starts acting like my objections are what made it difficult instead of the decision itself. He didn't argue. He just said he understood. I asked him when he could realistically be out if he had to move fast, and this time he answered more honestly than before. He said he could probably figure something out within a few days, maybe sooner if he started making calls immediately. That answer mattered more than anything else he had told me so far, because it confirmed that this whole arrangement had been built around convenience, not necessity in the strictest sense. There were other options. They were just worse, less comfortable, less efficient, and probably more embarrassing to present inside the family as the plan. My apartment had not been the only solution. It had just been the smoothest one to claim while I was gone. I told him I wanted him out within 3 days. When I said it, the room went quiet in a different way than before. Not hostile, not explosive, but real in a way that stripped everything back to what it actually was. He looked at me for a second, not angry, just tired and maybe a little stunned that the abstract idea of this might be a problem had now become an actual deadline. I didn't add anything dramatic after that. I didn't give a speech about boundaries or respect. I just repeated that 3 days was already me trying not to make the whole thing uglier than it needed to be, and that during those 3 days, nobody else was coming into the apartment, nobody else was getting invited over, and nothing about the arrangement was expanding another inch past what had already happened. He nodded again and said okay, and the fact that he accepted it that quickly told me he understood more than he was saying. Maybe he understood that I had every right to tell him to leave that night, and I wasn't doing it. Maybe he understood that our parents had put both of us in a bad position, just in different ways. Or maybe he just understood that I was done pretending this was casual. Whatever the reason, that was the first moment since I walked in that the situation started to feel like it had edges again. The rest of that evening was one of the strangest domestic experiences I've ever had, precisely because nothing dramatic happened, and yet everything felt wrong. He got up at one point and asked if I wanted anything from the kitchen, which would have been a perfectly normal sentence in almost any other context. And I remember thinking how absurd it felt that someone was offering me food out of my own kitchen while staying in my apartment without my consent. I said no. He made something small for himself and kept moving around the place more carefully than before, and every movement made it obvious that the illusion of comfort was gone now. The apartment had stopped being a solution and turned back into what it actually was, which was my space, temporarily occupied by someone who had no independent claim to it. I didn't say much after that, partly because I was tired and partly because there was nothing useful left to say that night. I took a shower, unpacked some of my stuff, and tried to decide what I was going to do about sleeping. The bedroom had already been used, and I knew that in practical terms it was still my room, and I had every right to go in there and sleep like I normally would. But there is something psychologically irritating about reclaiming a space in front of someone who has already been living around it, as if it were neutral territory. In the end, I slept there anyway, mostly because giving that up too would have crossed some line in my own head that I wasn't willing to cross. I didn't sleep well, not because I thought he was going to do anything, but because every sound in the apartment felt different now. The floors shifting in the living room, the faint movement of someone else getting water, the sense that even the quiet belonged to more than one person for the moment. All of it made the place feel less like home and more like a situation I had to get through. And what kept replaying in my head while I lay there was not even the argument with our parents or the image of my brother sitting on the couch. It was the plain, stupid fact that they had all let themselves believe this was normal enough to set in motion while I was away. That was the thing that made it hard to let go of mentally. If someone lies to you outright, at least you know what happened. Here, what I was dealing with was worse in a quieter way. They had not needed a villain story to do it. They had just needed enough shared family logic to convince themselves that they were entitled to decide first and explain later. And once people get comfortable with that kind of reasoning, it rarely stays contained to one incident. The next morning I woke up before him, which I was glad for, because I needed a little time in the apartment by myself before the day started again. I made coffee in my own kitchen and stood there listening to the silence for a few minutes. And even that felt slightly different from how it normally did, because instead of being simple and empty and mine, it carried the awareness that someone else would wake up soon and walk into it. I hated how quickly the place had changed in my head, and I hated even more that the change had nothing to do with physical damage. It was all context. That's what people who overstep never seem to understand. They think if they leave everything mostly tidy and mostly respectful, then the violation is smaller. It isn't. Sometimes it is exactly the context that does the damage. When he woke up, the interaction was polite in that exhausted way people are after a bad night and an unresolved situation. He told me he would start making calls that morning and see what he could line up. I said good. He asked if I wanted me to tell our parents the same thing or if I was going to talk to them myself. I told him I was going to talk to them myself, because at that point I didn't trust the message not to get softened in transit. He nodded like he understood why, and he probably did. After he left the apartment for a while that morning, I called my parents and told them what the new timeline was. My mom reacted first by trying to slow everything down immediately, asking whether I wasn't moving too fast, whether 3 days was really necessary, whether I could at least give it a little more time so nobody had to scramble. And the wording there was exactly what I expected. Once they realized they couldn't make the situation permanent through politeness, they switched to the idea that any firm timeline at all was too harsh. My dad was more blunt. He said I was making the whole thing harder than it needed to be. I told both of them, as clearly as I could, that the situation had only become hard because they chose to create it without involving me, and that 3 days was not me being harsh. It was me being more accommodating than I had any obligation to be. They didn't like that answer, obviously, because once you say it that plainly, the conversation stops being about their intentions and starts being about the actual sequence of what they did. And that sequence was impossible to defend cleanly. They gave away my key, moved my brother in, let him stay there for days, and only intended to loop me in after the fact, if at all. The conversation with them that morning didn't resolve anything emotionally, but it did settle the practical side. They understood the timeline was not a suggestion. They also understood, I think for the first time, that this wasn't one of those situations where I would get over it just because enough people acted like it should already be over. By the time I got off the phone, I knew the real confrontation wasn't going to be about whether my brother stayed 3 more days or 2 more days. That part was already basically done. The real confrontation was with the fact that all of them had treated my home like an available family asset the second I wasn't physically inside it. And whether they admitted that directly or not, there was no going back from me knowing that about them. Those 3 days did not feel long in the normal sense, but they felt long in the way any situation feels long when your own home stops functioning as the place where you reset and starts functioning as a problem you are managing in real time. Nothing dramatic happened during them, and in a strange way that almost made the whole thing harder to shake off, because if there had been a screaming match or some obvious scene, maybe I could have attached all my anger to one clean moment and been done with it. Instead, what I got was something quieter and, because of that, more believable in the worst possible way. My brother moved carefully, talked carefully, and clearly understood that whatever casual permission structure he thought he had when I first walked in had disappeared the second I came back and saw what had been done. He did what he said he was going to do, which was start making calls and trying to line things up somewhere else. And every conversation I overheard from the kitchen or the hallway made it more obvious that there had always been other options, just not convenient ones. That part mattered to me more than I expected. If the truth had been that there was genuinely nowhere else for him to go, I still would have been angry about how my parents handled it, but at least there would have been some hard edge of necessity around the whole thing. What made it harder to forgive was realizing that my apartment had not been used because it was the only possible answer. It had been used because it was the smoothest answer. It was the option with the least friction for everyone except the person whose consent actually mattered. My mom called again the first afternoon after I laid down the deadline, and the conversation started exactly the way I knew it would. She did not open by saying I was wrong. She opened by trying to smooth the emotional texture of the situation until the actual decision felt harsher than the thing that caused it. She asked whether things were calmer now, whether we had talked, whether maybe it would help to give the situation a little more room instead of forcing it so quickly. Every sentence was built to make extension sound reasonable and firmness sound emotional. I told her nothing had changed about the central problem, and because I knew she would keep trying to pull the conversation away from that point, I repeated it in almost the same words. I said the issue was never whether he needed help. The issue was that they had given someone access to my home without asking me and expected me to adjust after the fact. She kept coming back to the same cluster of ideas, which was that he was family, that it was temporary, and that nobody meant any harm. None of that answered what I was actually saying, which is exactly why she kept using it. At one point, she asked whether I really wanted to create this kind of distance over something that could have been handled more softly, and that question annoyed me more than everything that came before it because it took the consequence of what they had done and treated it like my decision rather than the result of theirs. I told her as calmly as I could that distance is what happens when people stop trusting that you will respect a simple boundary, and once I said that, she went quiet for a second in a way that was different from before. It was not agreement, exactly, but it was the kind of pause people make when they realize the conversation has finally reached the actual cost of what they did, and they don't have a nice family-friendly phrase ready for it. My dad was less delicate when he called later that same day. He said I was turning a temporary fix into a bigger principal issue than it needed to be, which was completely predictable coming from him, because when he is uncomfortable with the shape of a problem, he tries to reduce its scale instead of arguing its logic. If it sounds smaller, then reacting strongly to it starts sounding excessive, and if your reaction sounds excessive, then suddenly the original act becomes easier to excuse. I told him that a person deciding who lives in my apartment while I am away is already a principal issue whether he likes the phrase or not, and he didn't have much to say to that besides some version of, "We were trying to help," which by then had started to sound less like an explanation and more like a family reflex. That evening, when my brother got back from wherever he had been, he looked tired in the very ordinary way people look when they have spent the day making calls they don't want to make and hearing answers they hoped not to hear. He told me he had maybe found a place to crash with a friend for a while, but it would be cramped and awkward and not ideal. I said I understood, and I did, but I also said that awkward and not ideal was not the same thing as impossible, and that was probably the cleanest summary of the entire situation. Nobody had been facing impossibility. They had been trying to avoid awkwardness by spending my space. He sat down after that, and, for the first time since I got back, actually spoke about our parents in a way that made it clear he was starting to see the situation from a different angle. He said they made it sound like I already knew, or at least like I was the kind of person who wouldn't care enough to make it a real issue. That sentence stayed with me because it was probably the most honest description of the family dynamic anyone had said out loud so far. Not that I had agreed. Not even necessarily that they had lied outright in some deliberate, cinematic way. They had simply built the whole thing on the belief that I would absorb the inconvenience quietly, because I usually did. Once that got said plainly, the whole structure of what happened looked smaller and uglier at the same time. Smaller, because it was not some giant conspiracy. Uglier, because it was exactly the kind of casual entitlement families normalized for years until someone finally names it. The second day was less tense on the surface, but in some ways more clarifying. My brother had already started pulling his things back together in small ways, and even that changed how the apartment felt. The jacket that had looked settled before was folded and moved nearer the bag. The charger was unplugged. The food in the fridge was still there, but now it looked temporary in a way it had not when I first saw it. It was strange how quickly context could change the emotional weight of an object. Nothing material had changed much. What had changed was the assumption around it. That afternoon, my mom sent me a longer message instead of calling, and the message was exactly the kind of thing people write when they want to sound thoughtful without fully admitting what they did. She said she understood that maybe they should have spoken to me first, but she hoped I could also understand that everyone was under pressure and trying to do what made the most sense in the moment. That maybe attached to should have spoken to me first irritated me more than the rest of the message combined, because even then, with everything already exposed, she was still trying to leave herself a little room. Not full accountability, just partial acknowledgement shaped like compromise. I did not answer right away, because I knew if I responded immediately, I would make the message more emotional than it needed to be, and what I wanted by that point was not a satisfying reply. I wanted something that would make my position impossible to misrepresent later. So when I finally answered, I kept it simple. I said that pressure does not create the right to decide for someone else, and that if they had asked me first, the answer might still have been difficult, but at least the decision would have been real. Then I added that what changed things was not the request itself, but the fact that it had been made in my absence and treated as already resolved. She responded with a much shorter message after that, and the tone was noticeably different. Less persuasive, more cautious. She said she heard what I was saying. Not that she agreed with all of it. Not that she saw it exactly the same way, but that she heard it. I knew better than to treat that as some giant breakthrough, but it still mattered, because families like mine do not usually jump straight from entitlement to clarity. They back into it one half step at a time, usually only after the easy pressure route stops working. By the third day, the tension in the apartment had flattened into something almost normal looking from the outside, which is often what happens right before a temporary arrangement ends. People stop testing whether the situation can be extended and start focusing instead on getting through the last stretch without another blow-up. My brother packed more seriously that morning, and there was an odd, muted quality to the whole process because we were both behaving like adults trying not to make each other's lives harder than necessary, while also both knowing none of this should have happened the way it did. He asked me at one point whether I was going to stay angry about it for a long time, and it was one of the few questions he asked that did not feel defensive or strategic. It felt tired and honest, which is probably why I answered it honestly. I told him I was less angry at him than at how the whole thing was handled, but that it would take a while before I stopped seeing the apartment differently. He asked what I meant, and I told him the truth, which was that once somebody lives in your space without your permission, even if they did not mean harm, the place stops feeling completely neutral for a while. You start seeing the chain of decisions instead of just the furniture. He nodded like that made sense, and then, after a second, he said our parents always do that thing where they solve the immediate problem first and only think about whose line they crossed afterward. That was probably the closest either of us came to summing up the whole family issue in one sentence. And because it was true, there wasn't really anything to add. He left later that afternoon. There was no dramatic goodbye, no last-minute speech, no weird attempt to force the situation into something emotionally neat. He carried his bag out, took the rest of his things, handed me back the key, and said he knew the whole thing had been messed up. Not messed up for everyone. Not badly timed. Just messed up. I appreciated that more than I expected to, partly because it was simple and partly because it did not sound rehearsed. I said I knew he had been put in a bad position too, but that it still could not happen again. He said he knew. Then he left. The silence after he closed the door behind him was one of the strangest parts of the whole experience, because in theory the problem was over. The apartment was mine again, physically speaking. But physical reality is only part of it. I stood there for a while and looked around the living room, and the place did not feel immediately restored just because it was empty again. That kind of trust in a space returned slowly, not instantly. I opened the windows, changed the bedding, cleaned the kitchen more thoroughly than it probably needed, and put everything back exactly where I wanted it. Not because I am obsessive, but because I needed the place to stop feeling like something shared and start feeling like mine again in a way my body could register. Over the next week, the real aftermath had less to do with my brother and more to do with my parents. They did not push the issue again, which was good, but they also did not really admit the shape of what they had done in a full, clean way. What they did instead was move more carefully around me. The calls were normal, but slightly more measured. Requests that would once have been phrased as assumptions started arriving as actual questions. Nobody said, "We learned our lesson," because families almost never narrate their growth that neatly, but the adjustment was there if you paid attention. The first real test of that came maybe 10 days later when my mom called to ask if I could do something small for one of them, and the difference was obvious immediately. She asked. She waited. She did not package it as already expected, and she did not act surprised that there was even a pause before I answered. That pause mattered to me more than whatever the task itself was, because it proved something had shifted. Not perfectly, and maybe not permanently, but enough that they knew the old method was no longer safe. I still saw them. We still had dinners. The family did not split in two, and nobody went no contact and wrote each other out of their lives. That is not how most situations like this end in real life anyway. Usually what happens is quieter and, in some ways, more permanent. The relationship stays, but the terms change. You stop assuming innocence where you used to. You pay more attention to how requests are framed. You notice when someone tries to use urgency to skip your answer. And most importantly, the next time somebody starts treating your silence like consent, you recognize it faster. That was really the lasting effect of the whole thing. Not that my brother stayed in my apartment for a few days while I was away, though that was bad enough. It was that I saw very clearly how easily my family could slide from, "We're just helping each other," into "We already decided this, and you'll probably be fine with it." Once you see that mechanism in motion, you do not really unsee it. And in a strange way, that made the whole incident bigger than the few days it lasted and smaller than some giant family rupture at the same time. Bigger, because it forced me to reevaluate the terms on which closeness in my family had always worked. Smaller, because the practical part of it ended quickly enough. The apartment was mine again. My brother moved out. Life kept going. But the expectation that I would always absorb the cost of other people's convenience just because we share blood took a real hit. And that part, more than anything else, is what made the whole ugly situation worth drawing the line over. By the time a few weeks had passed, the emotional edge of it had dulled, but the structural lesson stayed exactly where it should have. I changed how I handle my spare key. I stopped assuming that family knows better than to do that was a real protection. And when people say now that situations inside a family are never simple, I agree with them more than I used to, just not in the way they usually mean. They say it as an excuse for blurred boundaries. I say it as the reason boundaries have to be clearer. Because the truth is, strangers usually know exactly when they are overstepping. Family is often the group most likely to convince itself that overstepping is just another word for helping. And once you have had to reclaim your own home from that mindset, even quietly, you stop mistaking the two.